Iran is in chaos. Production of oil goes down from 6 million barrels a day to 3 million. Sometimes they say 4 million. Nobody really knows. But the oil companies know that there is a 5% shortage between supply and demand. And this is the realities that we are moving into, an interdependent one world.
Right now, oil has cleared $100 a barrel, and global markets have shed trillions. Across Asia, petrol stations are running dry as countries like the Philippines declare a state of emergency. We are witnessing the worst energy shock ever recorded, a crisis that for most people alive today feels unprecedented. But 50 years ago, Kuan Yew lived through the exact same thing. This is the story of how he beat the crisis and what it tells us about where we're headed in 2026 and beyond if the situation in Iran remains unresolved.
The quadrupling of oil prices has changed the outlook for the whole world. We were planning for 12% growth. Now, we may have to settle for 6 to 8% real growth this year, depending on how the industrial countries recover for the rest of the year.
In the early 1970s, Singapore was a fledgling nation, growing at 13% a year since its independence in 1965, making it one of the fastest growing economies on Earth. But everything changed in October 1973, when Egypt and Syria launched a surprise attack on Israel to reclaim the Sinai Peninsula and the Golan Heights. Because America intervened by airlifting billions of dollars of military equipment to Israel, the Arab oil states retaliated by cutting production and imposing an oil embargo. As a result, oil quadrupled overnight, shooting up from $3 a barrel to $12. Consequently, Singapore's growth collapsed from 13% to 4%, while inflation hit 22%, sending the global economy into a spiral.
1975 is the first time since 1965 that we experienced almost zero growth in our GDP. The momentum of our economy carried us through last year with a 6.8% growth, whilst America, Japan, and most of Western Europe suffered massive declines. But the recession has caught up with us. From January to June this year, our GDP barely grew at all, 0.2%. compared to the same period last year.
Then, only a few years later, it happened again. In 1979, the Iranian Revolution toppled the Shah, triggering a collapse in production that cut 4.8 million barrels a day from the market. This was roughly 7% of the world's supply, and it sent oil prices climbing from $13 a barrel in mid-1979 to a staggering $34 by mid-1980. As long lines returned to petrol stations, recession swept across the developed world, forcing even the US Federal Reserve to hike interest rates to 20% in a desperate bid to combat rampant inflation. Ultimately, Iran, the country at the center of both that 1979 crisis and the one we are living through today, proved it could bring the global economy to its knees simply by disrupting the flow of oil. And if you thought your investments were safe, think again. Stocks in the S&P 500 and the Dow Jones lost almost 50% of their value during that first oil crisis. And because inflation stayed so high, many investors saw their portfolios stay flat for almost 2 decades. Additionally, food prices jumped 14.5% in America alone, while Singapore's domestic food inflation peaked at a staggering 60% in late 1973.
Our biggest problem has been the sharp increase in prices of food and essentials. We cannot look for soft options like subsidizing food, absorbing the rise in oil prices, and keeping down electricity charges. We do not have oil wells, nor do we grow rice, corn, or soya beans. The feedstuff for our pigs and chickens is imported at world market prices.
Singapore was in shock. You see, just before the first oil crisis, Singapore was experiencing rapid economic growth since its independence in 1965. Unemployment had fallen from around 9% to 4.5% as multinational corporations flooded the island. At the same time, Singapore had become one of the world's major oil refining centres, with 4 refineries built in just over a decade processing over 1 million barrels a day. But when the oil embargo hit, Lee faced a choice that would define the nation's future. The math was simple. Singapore's refineries held enough oil to power the island for 2 full years. He could have seized it all, played the populist, and shielded his people from the global chaos. Instead, he did the opposite, stating, "Within days of the oil crisis in October 1973, I decided to give a clear signal to the oil companies that we did not claim any special privilege over the stocks of oil they held in their Singapore refineries. If we blocked export from those stocks, we would have enough oil for our own consumption for 2 years, but we would have shown ourselves to be completely undependable." By putting global reliability above immediate relief, he proved Singapore was the most dependable partner in the world trade system. His strategy paid off. By the 1990s, Singapore didn't just survive, it became the world's 3rd largest oil refining hub, trailing only Houston and London. Its reputation also acted as a magnet for global capital, allowing the nation to thrive in the decades after the crisis. However, reliability was only one pillar of Singapore's success. As the global energy map shifted, Lee began studying how other resource-poor nations were surviving the shock, and his eyes turned to Japan.
What we must do is really achieve our maximum, which means using the talent that we've got to maximum advantage, which is what the Japanese have done. No natural resources. 100 million Japanese, 900 million Chinese. I don't know, I don't believe the Japanese are that much cleverer than the Chinese, but look at the productivity. And it's knowledge, know-how, organization, technical skills, the technology, the capital that they have, the trading knowledge, the links they have with the rest of the world.
In May 1975, he travelled to Tokyo to see their approach firsthand, stating, "I found that all offices and public buildings, including their top hotels, had reduced power use. That summer, the temperature in my air-conditioned hotel room could not be brought below a minimum of 25 degrees Celsius. The chambermaids assiduously switched off all lights and air conditioners every time we left our rooms." You see, Japan had been pushed to the brink. Importing 80% of its energy, the 1973 shock caused its GDP to shrink for the first time since the war. Factories shuttered, and citizens fought in the streets over basic goods like toilet paper. But the government's response was a masterclass in mobilization. As Lee observed, the construction industry took conservation measures to prevent heat loss through external walls and windows. Manufacturers improved the efficiency of domestic appliances, like air conditioners, and were required to display the power efficiency of each. The government gave tax incentives for installing energy-saving equipment. No wonder Japan achieved the lowest electricity consumed per unit of industrial production. As a result, the methods Japan developed during this crisis allowed them to capture the American car market. As US consumers abandoned their V8 guzzlers for fuel-efficient Hondas and Toyotas, the global power balance shifted. By 1980, Japan had done the unthinkable. It surpassed the United States to become the largest automobile manufacturer on Earth. Even today, with the Strait of Hormuz closed and oil markets in chaos, Japan's discipline and preparedness remains its ultimate buffer. They hold over 200 days of petroleum reserves, a staggering contrast to resource-rich Australia, which sits on just 3 weeks of physical fuel. But today, perhaps an even greater irony is unfolding. Just as the 1970s oil shock launched Japanese cars to the world, the oil situation today is now fueling a Chinese EV takeover. While Singapore tried to replicate many of Japan's policies during the 1970s oil crises, Lee admitted that it could not replicate its ingrained work culture, stating, "We managed to cut down our use of electricity, but nowhere as effectively as the Japanese. Unfortunately, we are not as well trained and disciplined as the Japanese, and we never achieved their standards."
Amongst the factors that make a people better at overcoming economic problems are first, the cohesiveness of their society. Second, industrious and competent workers and managers. And third, most important of all, the ability of a people and their government together to take tough decisions and stick to them. Now, I believe the Japanese also have these qualities, and so they will overcome their present grave difficulties, economic difficulties.
By implementing a wide range of measures to improve productivity and slash energy consumption, Singapore emerged from the 1970s relatively unscathed. As Lee recalled, we urged our people to conserve energy and reduce consumption of fuel and electricity. There was belt tightening, but no hardship. To my relief, we did not suffer a big loss of jobs. Our unemployment rate remained around 4.5%. But the decades since have brought a new set of challenges. Singapore has strategically diversified away from oil toward natural gas, which now powers roughly 95% of the nation's electricity. However, this created a new vulnerability, as roughly half of Singapore's LNG came from Qatar before the current Iran conflict. But Lee had already gamed out this exact vulnerability. To ensure the city-state was never left at the mercy of global shocks, Singapore spent years building a massive strategic buffer. They invested in months of stockpiles and specialized underground infrastructure like the Jurong rock caverns. As Lee put it, because we fear that our gas suppliers from Malaysia and Indonesia may break their contracts, we're setting up an LNG terminal to store gas and getting gas from Qatar and other places. We will not be held hostage. We have to constantly adjust our position. Nothing stays static.
We are buying gas from our neighbors. Our neighbors are thinking of upping the price in spite of a contract. So we are preparing an LNG station to buy gas from Qatar and store it.
But storage is only half the battle. To truly decouple from global volatility, Singapore has made moves to generate its own power, including the Tengeh Floating Solar Farm, one of the world's largest inland floating solar systems. However, Lee understood that renewables alone could not yet provide the baseload power needed to replace oil and gas. Despite the public outcry following the Fukushima disaster, he believed that until renewables could reach a massive scale, nuclear power was the only viable alternative for a resource-constrained state.
Every country will have to consider nuclear power. Can it be managed after the fearful events at Fukushima, where an earthquake and a tsunami and the breakdown of the nuclear power station? Yes, I think it can. And it must, because there's no other choice. US and China is trying to do the same, to have nuclear-powered submarines that can stay under the ocean for years without detection. Now, if they can make nuclear machines, power machines, that safe for a group of 150 people or more in a submarine, it is not beyond the imagination of man to make it safe for multiples of that number.
Once again, the data suggests he was right. As the 2026 Hormuz crisis shows no signs of resolution, the world's industrial giants are retreating to nuclear. Last month, Japan restarted Unit 6 of Kashiwazaki Kariwa, the largest nuclear plant on Earth. They now have 15 reactors back online, racing toward a goal of 20% nuclear power by 2040. China is following suit with 37 reactors currently under construction. Even the titans of the new economy are now moving to secure dedicated nuclear capacity to keep their energy-hungry AI data centers afloat. For Singapore, the solution may lie offshore. The government is currently investigating floating nuclear power plants, modular reactors placed on reinforced barges. By moving this infrastructure offshore, Singapore could finally bypass its geographical limits, securing not just the total energy independence, but the clean, carbon-free future that Kuan Yew spent a lifetime chasing.
Nuclear will destroy the whole island if something goes wrong. So we were tossing around the idea of buying a submarine nuclear generator, which you put on a floating platform. And if it leaks, we take it out into the Pacific.
So, where does that leave the world today? While resource-poor Asia is once again reeling from a supply shock, Kuan Yew noted that the Americans were uniquely positioned to weather the storm. As he put it, shale gas promises to make the North Americans energy independent, an unprecedented feat. The Middle East will become less important and will lose power. The threat of a global recession triggered by spiraling oil prices is much reduced today. While Lee is not alive to witness the crashing markets and fracturing supply chains of 2026, the reality is far more dangerous than the 1970s. That era was defined by a political embargo, a crisis eventually resolved through diplomacy. However, today involves the physical destruction of the infrastructure itself, meaning the recovery will be slower and the fallout much worse. Most critically, the stakes have shifted beyond a struggle for fuel. We are now operating in the shadow of a nuclear conflict.